Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about Puerto Rico's massive debt crisis and the economic and humanitarian problems it's causing. Joining me now from Orlando, Florida, is Phillip Arroyo. He is an activist, writer, and columnist. And with us here in the studio is Hector Cordero-Guzman. He is a professor at the School of Public Affairs with the City University of New York. Welcome to both of you to the show. Phillip, let me start with you. We just heard there from the former Secretary of State of Puerto Rico, Kenneth McClintock, on his view on what caused this debt crisis. What is your perspective? How did Puerto Rico get to this?
Well, in all due respect to Secretary McClintock, I was a little surprised by his timid remarks when he mentioned and acknowledged that this fiscal board bill in Congress is not the best bill and that he would change some things, but we had to accept it. No, I think the people of Puerto Rico should not accept this bill. It's totally undemocratic. It's totally un-American. This is nothing more than a total fiscal and corporate takeover of the people of Puerto Rico, where the people of Puerto Rico would have zero control over its finances, zero control over its own government. And I think the United States government, U.S. Congress, both Republican and Democrats who vote for this bill should be ashamed of themselves. I think it's a travesty of democracy. It's an international violation of the UN Charter, and I think that the United States is going to have a lot of explaining to do this summer within the UN Committee on Decolonization, which will meet next month.
Hector, if, as Phillip says, this bill should be rejected by Puerto Rico, what's the alternative?
Well, right now there's no other alternative on the table, right? There's three things that could happen. We either do nothing and the crisis continues to accelerate, non-payments come and the lawsuits will begin in earnest, and it will be very painful and uncertain. The second option is the option that's being considered now, which is some sort of restructuring, some sort of bankruptcy-like proceeding. And the third option is what's known as a bailout, or in essence, the U.S. taxpayers would fund resources for Puerto Rico and some resources to pay the debt. That option Congress has taken off the table. The option of doing nothing has also been taken off the table. So now we're kind of stumbling with this bill that obviously has a lot of problems, as Phillip and even the former Secretary of State McClinton acknowledged. The bill does one thing right, which is it provides a mechanism for the restructuring of the debt. It forces the borrowers and the banks to sit down and come to an agreement, and it forces that agreement.
But that agreement is on how the money gets paid back. There's no bailout here, right?
No, there's no taxpayer money, which I think is actually a problem and disingenuous, because Puerto Rico needs a mechanism to renegotiate the debt. It needs some kind of financial support and technical assistance, but it also needs parity in terms of access to federal dollars and resources for many of the programs that the population needs. Puerto Rico has a 46% poverty rate, which is double that of any other state, and a 55% child poverty rate, which is much higher than any state. So it's a poor place. And by simply rearranging the chairs of the Titanic, as it were, you don't prevent it from hitting the iceberg. And I think it's not telling our fellow Americans the right lesson by insisting that this can be done on the cheap, or that this can be done with no cost, or that this can be done with no pain. That's going to be tried, it's going to fail, and we're going to be here a year or 2 years from now asking for more economic development resources. So a real project.
If I can just jump in there and interject 1 second.
Yes.
I have to disagree on that. I think that the United States has a moral obligation to respond to the democratic will of the people of Puerto Rico, who in November of 2012 voted for statehood, voted for equality, and Congress turned their backs on Puerto Rico. Why did they turn their backs on Puerto Rico? Because corporate CEOs in Wall Street picked up the phone, called those government officials in Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., and told them Puerto Rico can't be a state, because if it becomes a state, we won't be able to dodge trillions of dollars in corporate taxes as they do in Puerto Rico. That's the bottom line. That's the truth. And I don't know what's the problem with the word bailout. I think that the United States government, the least they can do is provide a bailout to the people of Puerto Rico, because when it came to the Vietnam War, where thousands of Puerto Ricans gave their lives for democracy in the United States, when they can't vote for the commander-in-chief, I think that the United States should bail out the people of Puerto Rico, especially when they've evaded trillions of dollars through their corporations and used and sacrificed thousands of Puerto Rican lives in Puerto Rico for their wars.
Well, the key is to provide economic development resources to revive the economy. And I completely agree with you that that's a federal government responsibility. It's the federal government that runs and sets the parameters under which the Puerto Rican economy can function. It's the federal government that writes the rules and regulations, the tax laws that apply to corporations in Puerto Rico. And when they changed those, it had big repercussions on the economy of the island 10 years ago when it really started declining. So Puerto Rico needs a mechanism to deal with the debt, but it also needs a mechanism to revive its economy. Right. Without reviving the economy, there's not going to be any overall solution to the migration challenge or to the economic fiscal challenge of the island.
Okay, but Hector, is the onus right now on debtors to come to a solution to get something on the table? Because there was one debt payment of $399 million, which was supposed to have been paid when? On May 2nd?
Yes.
It was not paid. Now we've got this $2 billion coming up on July 1st. If those payments are not made, what happens?
Well, if those payments are not made, the banks are going to sue the government of Puerto Rico to demand the payment. And some federal judge is going to have to then decide what happens with Puerto Rico's resources. Where are they going to go? The Constitution says that Puerto Rico ought to pay its the banks first and then provide essential resources. It would be difficult to see any kind of federal judge that would make a decision to uphold that, which is why there's a bill in Congress to create a stay while there are some negotiations. It appears that every side prefers negotiations to some chaotic run to the courthouse with an uncertain outcome. And the lenders are going to start suing each other also, because there are 18 different types of debt in Puerto Rico, and not all of it has the same ranking. And right now, they're treated as similar categories. But if they go to court, then the lenders that have the highest preference are going to demand that they get paid first, and are going to go after the resources for the lenders that are in second or third preference. And that's going to be a huge legal problem between the banks and Puerto Rico and among the lenders themselves, who right now don't agree. So it's preferred, I think, that everyone sits down and finds a negotiated solution. My challenge is that you can't pretend it can be on the cheap.
Okay. Go ahead, Phillip.
Hector mentioned the fact that some special tax incentives were cut in 2006, which is the Section 936 tax incentives. But he doesn't mention the fact, and I'm pretty sure Secretary McClintock didn't mention it because it's not beneficial to his argument. In 2012, the Statehood Party, when they were in power, they created Law 20 and Law 22 of 2012. Now, what were those bills? Those laws actually was like a local version of Section 936, where even billionaires who are not Puerto Rican will only have to live in Puerto Rico for 6 months and would be totally tax exempt on their corporate taxes. I think that's a disgrace. And I think that the fact that the Statehood Party actually presented and passed that, it goes total contradictory to what they stand for. Okay. Because you can't be supporting statehood and then going behind closed doors and negotiating with CEOs.
Phillip, you're absolutely right in that when you ask how did Puerto Rico come to this crisis, how did it get to this crisis? It got to this crisis because of lenders that were willing to lend money without really getting assurances of how the money was going to be paid back. And it also got here because Puerto Rico did not tax corporations or its wealthier citizens. And those same
lenders donated to Puerto Rican politicians.
Correct. And they did not tax its citizens that are higher earning citizens or its corporations enough to generate the kinds of resources that it needed to be able to provide the services and to be able to pay back to the lenders.
Okay, Phillip, right now there is talk of restructuring. That proposal that's sitting in Congress right now is a restructuring plan for Puerto Rico to pay back its debts. To what extent is that just kicking the can down the road?
I think that's the best way to describe it. I think it's political football. I think the Republican Party is a disgrace, along with the Democratic members within the committee who voted for it. I think that those Democratic members would have to respond to their constituents. We have to remember that the original text of this bill, of this fiscal oversight bill, did not include a seat for the governor of Puerto Rico, which is totally undemocratic. After some severe fighting within committee, they finally seated and they created a seat for the governor of Puerto Rico. But get this, the governor can sit on the seat, but he doesn't have a vote. So the United States government rejected, number one, they rejected the will of the people of Puerto Rico who voted 61% for statehood. They rejected any type of bankruptcy. And now they're saying, you know what, your governor can sit on the board, but he doesn't have a vote. I think it's a disgrace. I think it's time for the Puerto Rican people to demand respect. And I have to agree with Bernie Sanders. He's absolutely right. Puerto Rico is a colony, And this is just an attempt by corporate America to turn Puerto Rico into a giant golf course and have Puerto Rican and the poor serve them lemonade. And I think that under our watch, we cannot let that happen.
All right, Hector, in that conversation I had with Kenneth McClintock, he didn't seem to think that Puerto Rico would have to prioritize who gets paid first. Do you believe that to be the case?
Not at all, and I think he was being very disingenuous by beginning the problem the year that his government and his administration left office. Right. There was a lot of responsibility that is shared in terms of Puerto Rico's crises. And the previous administration and administrations before it have really borrowed and did borrow nilly-willy and weren't willing to make the cuts he suggests now should be made back when they were in power to be able to make those cuts. So I think it's easy now in hindsight to suggest somebody else should do something that they themselves weren't willing to do. So I think the Secretary of State was kind of playing politics with these answers in that regard.
Yeah, it appears to be a very classic solution. Cuts, and then what happens next? Tax increases?
Well, the previous administration fired some 20,000 government workers, and all that did was accentuated the recession. You can track the decrease in government employment in Puerto Rico and the decrease in Puerto Rico's GDP per capita. So the challenge that Puerto Rico has is that an austerity plan, which is what this bill basically proposes, and cuts so that the money is used to pay bondholders are not going to grow the economy. And what Puerto Rico needs right now is a formula for economic growth. And I agree completely with Phillip that tax-oriented gimmicks both to corporations and to rich people to settle in Puerto Rico and hire a cook here and a helicopter pilot there, as the Economic Development Secretary unfamously said in an interview was the economic benefit of those bills, is not the solution. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Congress need to take its full responsibility and provide Puerto Rico with the tools and the resources necessary to lift up its economy so that it is the true showcase of the Caribbean and not the embarrassment that it currently is for policies that I think Phillip has pointed out they've been pursuing in the interest of the very few, not paying attention to the 3.5 million of U.S. American citizens that happen to live in the island of Puerto Rico.
Right, and when you talk about cuts and diverting the money to pay debtors, that sounds ominously like what's happened in Greece.
In that regard, the debt crisis and the use of debt as a tool and a weapon against common citizens and common people is a universal phenomenon. Puerto Rico is the inside the U.S. Colony example of that. But Greece has a very similar relationship to the rest of Europe in terms of its power asymmetry, right?
Okay, Phillip, we talk a lot about the money that's owed, how this plan is going to work, etc. But what about the humanitarian impact on the people of Puerto Rico? I mean, what are they going through right now?
I think that should be the main focus within all this political dialogue with Puerto Rico. I think the fact that over 150 schools, public schools, have been closed down within the judicial system. The legal fund, public defender's budget, the public defender's office is cut by half. That means that more poor people will have less representation through the judicial process. I think it's just a travesty. It's a travesty, and I think that the bottom line, that the United States government will have to show the world, since this is an international show, the United States government will have to show the world if they truly believe in democracy or they pick money and corporate America over democracy. Because Puerto Ricans have been stripped of democracy by the very U.S. government that professes and preaches it worldwide. And then you have thousands of Puerto Rican soldiers who cannot vote for the President of the United States, for their commander-in-chief, the guy who sends them to war to die, and they don't have representation in Congress. And now they got slapped in the face with a fiscal board by Republicans saying, you know what, you have a governor on the seat, with a seat on the board, but shut up, he won't be able to vote. I think that's disrespectful, and I think it's time for the people of Puerto Rico to rise.
Right. Hector, the legislation that's in Congress right now, is that some kind of Band-Aid solution? I mean, do we need a long-term solution here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Congress is really, like you said before, kicking the can down the road, trying to find the easy, pretty sounding, cheap sounding, easy way out that is not really addressing the problem. And therefore, the crisis is going to continue. And it is a challenge. Puerto Rico's education system is suffering. Puerto Rico's health system is suffering. There are very few places in the world that are losing population at the rate that Puerto Rico is losing population. And that is a sign of a society that is not viable. And the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress are responsible and have a responsibility to address properly and comprehensively the challenges that Puerto Rico faces.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Hector, Cordero-Guzman, Phillip Arroyo, thanks to both of you for joining us.